1-0.
16 singles competing for love and money.
Approach the man.
How things pulse. Where the ice bars are tight, it's going to be windy. Where you get a little pulse in a tight circle like that, you're chasing a low across through southern England. That was one on its way. There doesn't seem to be another one. In fact, if anything, pressure's sort of building up through here. So by the end of the week, it looks a lot quieter. But the start was certainly wet. And the winds are coming in from the southwest. Orange in colour, that's the Met Office model telling us it's coming from the middle of the Atlantic, quite warm. But look what's happening here over Scotland, over the North Sea. Again, middle of the week, there's a change. As that pressure builds, so the air actually turns colder. Not for everybody, but as this shows you, it is likely to turn frosty in Scotland by the middle of the week. Doesn't look too severe, but it's certainly there. So a cooling trend, at least for some. But that is to come. In the immediate future, it's yet more rain. Yeah, it'll be quite a nice start today for eastern England. This is tomorrow. And southern Scotland, a bit of sunshine out. Highland Scotland back in the band of sleety or wet weather, and then yet again, and it's much like this morning, rain and strengthening winds will come through southern England and South Wales. They'll keep swinging up through during the day, so it'll be a pretty poor end today for Birmingham, Manchester, Leeds, Norwich and London. Might be better in Bristol though. And the winds are up too. Gale force winds, now they could gust quite strongly, maybe 70 miles an hour on the headlands of the English Channel, but more typically 50, 60, 65 in southern counties of England. Now, I'd like to be more than that, but even this, of course, is potentially damaging. There's little compensation, I think, in saying that the temperatures will still be in double figures, because it won't feel as nice as today. Lack of sunshine, more wind, and more rain. Now, looking ahead, generally speaking, I think you can split the country into two, as I suggested. For Scotland, you saw that wind change. It will turn cold. Now, at first, that means there'll be sleet or snow falling on Highland Scotland. By the end of Wednesday and into Thursday, it'll be settled down to sunshine, but it will be cold by day and frosty by night. For the rest of us, well, it starts wet and windy, it stays mild.
The hunt for the missing teenager Danielle Jones. The police have found a body. A US diplomat's wife and daughter die in a grenade attack at a church service in Pakistan. David Blunkett vows to reclaim the streets by targeting 10 crime black spots. And Rangers take the CIS Insurance Cup with a 4-0 win over Ayr United. This is BBC News 24. I'm Maxine Mawhinney. Good evening. The police investigating the disappearance of the teenager Danielle Jones are to examine the body of a young woman found at a cement works in Northfleet in Kent, close to the Blue Water shopping centre. 15-year-old Danielle went missing from her home in East Tilbury in Essex in June of last year.
Danielle Jones was last seen alive early on the morning of June the 18th last year while on her way to get a bus to school from her home village of East Tilbury. Her disappearance generated a huge public response.
To the line search, stick your hand up and our SOCO officers seem to come.
With the help of her school uniform, large numbers of local people turned out to help the police scour nearby heathland running down to the Thames, but without success. There was extensive media coverage, including a number of emotional witness appeals by her parents, again without locating either her or any of her belongings. At one point, a building site in nearby Grays was searched by specialist police officers. It was on Friday morning that workmen at a cement works across the Thames at Northfleet near the Blue Water shopping complex found the young woman's body. The police say the death is being treated as suspicious, but it's impossible to draw any conclusions until she's formally identified, possibly tomorrow or Tuesday. Kent police are liaising with Essex officers. Danielle's uncle, Stuart Campbell, is still being held on remand since he was charged with her murder last November in the absence of her body. Clarence Mitchell, BBC News.
The wife and daughter of an American diplomat are among 5 people who've died in a grenade attack on a Protestant church in the Pakistani capital, Islamabad. At least 40 others were injured. Pakistan's President General Musharraf said the attack was a ghastly act of terrorism. President Bush said he's outraged.
It took just a few horrific moments to transform a normal Sunday service into a bloodbath. The service sheets are now lying in the rubble. The sermon had been underway. There's blood on the ceiling. This was a devastating attack on a focal point for diplomats in Pakistan. A Bible sits covered in dust, and new fears are raised about Islamic militants striking back, today with grenades.
They had already 2, 3 at least had been thrown already, so then he threw, and then there was so much smoke you couldn't see anything.
The International Protestant Church in Islamabad has never been a target before. There was no obvious security. American Marines arrived on the scene in the aftermath. The concern now is that all Christians and Westerners in Pakistan will be vulnerable. As the injured were led to hospital, more than 40 of them, blame was immediately put on hardline groups opposed to America's war on terror. There was always a risk that the US action in Afghanistan would lead to reprisals, and these casualties may be victims of that. Hemmed in by nervous Pakistani officials, the American ambassador came to see the damage. Later, she sounded resolute. The campaign against terror would go on.
President Bush and President Musharraf and other courageous men and women around the world were absolutely right to take on the terrorists, no matter where they are.
Security was reinforced massively tonight. The Pakistani government is paying a price for siding with Washington, and this is it. David Shukman, BBC News.
The Prime Minister is to chair a new action group aimed at tackling rising street crime. The meeting later this week was announced as the Home Secretary promised to reclaim the streets by launching a blitz on muggers, carjackers and bag snatchers in 10 street crime black spots.
It's the 11 to 15 age group that's causing particular concern. What often starts with mobile phone thefts escalates to other street crimes which are on the increase. And the Home Secretary knows that whatever the figures say about a fall in the number of overall crimes, what matters is public perception.
Whilst crime overall has fallen, nobody really believes things are better unless they feel it in their own street, in their own neighbourhood. So there's no point in telling people that things are getting better if they don't actually believe it. So the issue of street crime, of robbery, a lot of it, over 50% of it in relation to mobile phones, makes a difference to the psychology. People don't feel safe.
A scheme already underway in the Metropolitan Police area will be spread to 9 other forces, the crime hotspots, targeting certain places at certain times of day in order to catch the culprits truanting or as they leave school. But it will put more pressure on already stretched officers.
We can do it in the short term by redirecting resources taken away from other areas, but how long we can continue to do that for remains to be seen. I mean, we need the extra police officers that have been promised.
Coming at the end of a week when off-duty police officers marched on Westminster to oppose their pay package, the Home Secretary's political opponents are warning that there's no quick fix.
What we need is a coordinated, long-term programme, changing the nature of British police and many other things too, our criminal justice system, the way we deal with young people. All those things need to change, and I don't think these things can be invented overnight.
The crackdown in street crime was due to be launched in the summer, but has been brought forward because of the rise in the number of incidents. Christine Stewart, BBC News.
Well, our reporter Daniel Betcher is in Oxford, which is one of the target areas, and he outlined the main problems there.
Well, the problems here, as in other parts of the country, are muggings, robberies, bag snatches, to a large extent also the theft of mobile phones. Now, while crime figures overall in this policing area and again in others around the country are falling, street crimes, these kinds of crimes that will now be targeted, are on the increase. That's what this initiative is about. The 10 force areas that have been chosen between them account for more than 80% of these kinds of crimes.
So how's it all going to work?
Well, this is going to work initially over a 6-month period, and what they will try to do is to try and increase the rates of detection, to try and focus on known trouble spots, to try and focus on known offenders, and also to try and speed up the whole court process to reduce the time between arrests and the time that somebody is actually found guilty and sent to prison.
And one of the things they want to do is put more police on the streets, but there isn't any more money for this initiative. They're going to take it from other areas.
Well, that is certainly the sense from many of those that will actually be at the front line, the officers that will actually be required to do this kind of work. They say, look, we're always being given new priorities, But what doesn't happen then is that we get the extra resources for the other priorities that we're also meant to be dealing with. So they're very concerned that if they put a lot more resources specifically into street crimes, into robberies, then they won't have the money, they won't have the time, they won't have the officers to do all the other things that they need to. But to some extent, officers will be moved from different duties, and there are other initiatives. For example, there's one already being carried out in London at the moment by the Metropolitan Police, where they're really using saturation coverage. They take people from duties such as dog handling, those kinds of things, and they use all of them to focus on particular areas at particular times of the day. These are all initiatives that are being tried at the moment, and if they work, all of this information will be used and applied to other force areas. But certainly the view from opposition parties, from the Conservatives, is very much that, yes, this will only work if more bobbies are put on the beat, if there is more money to make it work.
And very briefly, Daniel, is any chance of you gauging what the public reaction to this is going to be? I suppose that people will think that anything is better than nothing.
Yes, that's right. I mean, there is a sense that people are getting fed up specifically with these kinds of crimes, and that presumably is driving the politics. That's why these sorts of initiatives are being brought about. And also the Home Secretary said today it's all very well and good telling people that crime levels overall are falling, but if they don't actually see that, if the sense they get is still that they are under threat, that they may be robbed, have their phone snatched, their bag snatched, then that won't be good enough. They actually want to feel safer on their streets, and that is very much why he's using this phrase that he wants to reclaim the streets with this initiative.
Daniel Bircher. More than 1,400 crimes have been committed by prisoners released early under the government's tagging scheme. The Sunday Telegraph said that unpublished Home Office figures showed a range of offences, including 4 rapes and 3 kidnappings have been committed. Only convicts with no history of sexual or violent crime are eligible for release with an electronic tag. This is BBC News 24. Coming up, why up to 250,000 jobs in the British tourist industry could be at risk. Diplomatic efforts to broker a ceasefire in the Middle East have been marred by a shooting near Tel Aviv and a suicide bombing in northern Jerusalem. 2 Palestinians and an Israeli were killed in both accidents. The attacks ended 2 days of relative calm in the region and happened as the American envoy to the Middle East, Anthony Zinni, renewed his efforts to get the Israeli Prime Minister and the Palestinian leader to the negotiating table.
The uneasy calm of recent days shattered by a Palestinian gunman. It was a busy lunchtime in Kfar Saba, and he sprayed fire on passers-by in the town centre. 8 people were hit. Police and bystanders shot back, killing the gunman instantly. The injured were taken to hospital, where a woman later died of her wounds. These scenes were repeated in Jerusalem, where a suicide bomber injured several more people. General Zinni is still pressing for peace against increasing obstacles. The Israeli president said the Palestinian leader was squarely to blame for the latest violence.
Unfortunately, Chairman Yasser Arafat is inspiring such a brutal terrorist activity. If he used to call very often that he expects for 1 million shaheeds, it means that he's calling to the Palestinian youngsters to suicide themselves, and I believe that Yasser Arafat indeed has direct responsibility for such a brutal terrorist activity.
And at his cabinet meeting, the Israeli Prime Minister made clear that whatever progress the US envoy has made in his peace talks here, it's being whittled away. If Israelis come under fire, said Mr. Sharon, Israel will respond, regardless of whether ceasefire negotiations are taking place. At Yasser Arafat's headquarters, Palestinian officials were also toughening their stance, insisting there'd be no talks with Israel until its forces withdraw from the occupied territories known as Area A.
There won't be any meetings, whether political or security meetings with the Israeli side before the complete withdrawal of the Israeli troops from Area A, according to the understanding with the Americans and according to the Palestinian position.
You're going out today, or who knows?
Far from pulling out, Israeli tanks are continuing to patrol the streets of Beit Jala near Bethlehem. There have been sporadic exchanges of fire. Tensions are rising again. Richard Lister, BBC News, Jerusalem.
Robert Mugabe has been sworn in for a 5th term as Zimbabwe's president. The ceremony was boycotted by several countries, including Britain, who have denounced the election as fundamentally flawed. Mr. Mugabe called his victory a triumph against British imperialism. Well, BBC television correspondents are banned from Zimbabwe. Raghi Omer sends this report from neighbouring South Africa.
He has another 6 years in power, but there was little that was genuinely triumphant about President Mugabe's inauguration. There was the ceremonial honour guard, even an Air Force flypast. But there were no huge spontaneous crowds and few honoured guests. A few African leaders attended, but not the British or American ambassadors. Western diplomats boycotted the event. If they had attended, they would have heard President Mugabe's now familiar attack on Western imperialism.
No, no, never. Never again shall Zimbabwe be a colony.
That may be how he sees it, but to many it was a deeply flawed and rigged election victory. Thousands never got the chance to vote, and the poll was marred by weeks of intimidation and violence. His opponent says President Mugabe's days are numbered.
Although Mugabe has got the power, he has no legitimacy, neither does he have the economic resources to sustain it. And down the line, he's going to collapse.
Victory has not brought respite for President Mugabe. The presidents of South Africa and Nigeria are due to hold talks with President Mugabe tomorrow, and they're expected to pressure him to form a government of national unity with the opposition in order to stave off the prospect of more international sanctions and isolation. Raghi Omar, BBC News, South Africa.
The US Vice President has arrived in the Gulf state of Qatar on the latest leg of his tour of the Middle East. In the past few days, Dick Cheney also stopped in Oman and the United Arab Emirates. Our correspondent Tom Carver has been travelling with him, and he said the Vice President has received a mixed response.
He's had some quite tough weather to contend with, basically, because at every stop, although he's tried to talk about Iraq, all the Arab leaders are much more interested in talking about Israel and Palestinians and when is America going to get more involved in it. So he has been battling against a bit of a headwind. We don't really know what's been going on in the private meetings, of course, but publicly the Arab leaders have been pretty critical of the Americans, saying you really got to focus on the Middle East and peace if you expect us to support any attack on Iraq.
It's 6:15. These are the headlines. 9 months after the disappearance of the Essex teenager Danielle Jones, the police have found a body in nearby Kent. A US diplomat's wife and daughter are among 5 killed in a grenade attack at a church service in Pakistan. And the Home Secretary David Blunkett has vowed to reclaim the streets by targeting 10 crime black spots. This is BBC News 24, still to come. Place your bets. Could changes in Britain's gambling laws threaten the future of casinos? David Garrido has the sports headlines. David.
Thank you, Maxine. Good evening. Let's start with football, as the first trophy of the Scottish season has gone to Rangers. The SPL side have beaten First Division Ayr United 4-0 in the CIS Cup final at Hampden Park. Claudio Caniggia netted the Gers 3rd and 4th after Tory Andre Flo and Barry Ferguson had put them in command to give Alex McLeish his first trophy as Rangers manager. Now, Arsenal have moved up to 2nd place in the English Premiership with a 2-1 win over Aston Villa at Villa Park. Robert Pires scored their 2nd with this delightful chip. Leeds United have experienced an upturn in their league fortunes after a 3-1 victory at home to Blackburn Rovers. Harry Kewell rounded off the victory at Elland Road. And Ralf Schumacher has won today's Formula One Malaysian Grand Prix, taking the checkered flag ahead of Williams teammate Juan Pablo Montoya, with older brother Michael in 3rd. Well, those are the headlines. We'll have a full roundup of all of today's stories in Sports Day, which is in 20 minutes' time.
David, thank you. New research suggests that 250,000 jobs in the British tourism industry are at risk following the September the 11th attacks and the world economic downturn. The World Travel and Tourism Council, whose members include airlines and tour operators, predicts that spending by tourists will fall this year, but then pick up again in the longer term.
It's one of the country's leading hotels. More than half the guests are American. This weekend it's full, but immediately after September the 11th, room occupancy dropped by nearly 1/3.
The North Americans just weren't flying.
either for business or for pleasure. Taking into consideration that this is by far our largest market, it was catastrophic to the hotel industry in London.
The Tower is just one of the sights that makes this country such a popular destination with Americans. When they stopped coming, billions of pounds disappeared with them. Today's new figures predict that as a direct result of September the 11th, more than 250,000 jobs will go in tourism and related industries by the end of this year. That makes the UK one of the worst hit.
Among the developed countries, it's most probably be one of the worst. And the three major developed countries hit were the US, and that is very understandable, Germany and the UK.
The new Walt Disney theme park in Paris was unveiled to much fanfare this weekend. The worldwide tourism industry is also upbeat. It expects a recovery to start before the end of the year. Karen Hogan, BBC News.
There are fears that chemicals which are being blamed for changing the sex of male fish in British rivers could also have an effect on humans. A 5-year study by the Environment Agency, to be published later this month, reveals that pollution of rivers with estrogen-like chemicals is so high that nearly half of male fish are now starting to change sex. Scientists have told the BBC's Countryfile programme they're worried it may not just be wildlife that's affected.
Everything that we eat, put on our skin, throw down the drain, ends up in the sewage treatment works and ultimately in the river. So one could argue that we are actually living in a sea of estrogens, a chemical cocktail. And therefore, I think there are very real reasons to be worried about whether male reproductive health could also be affected in the same way that fish reproductive health is affected.
Changes to gaming laws could lead to more gambling addiction, according to some industry figures. Under government plans to deregulate the industry, rules governing casino membership will be relaxed, fruit machine jackpots will be increased, and online gambling legalised.
Gambling in a casino is known as hard gaming. The government wants to see clubs combining this with so-called soft gaming, such as bingo, under the same roof. Other proposals include legalising online gambling and increasing the jackpots in fruit machines. The government is keen to bring gambling laws up to date and says adults should be treated like adults. But gambling self-help groups say this will only serve to feed people's addictions.
We don't accept there's any such thing as soft gambling and hard gambling. Gambling is gambling. Once you've lost your money, you've lost it. You don't get it back. The idea of mixing the various forms will invariably lead certain people to try types of gambling they've not tried before. And this will mean more people gambling, more people recognising their potential to have a gambling problem, and therefore, invariably, our membership will grow.
The government says while adults would be given greater freedom under the new proposals, it would strive to ensure the protection of vulnerable groups such as children by, for example, outlawing fruit machines in certain public places. The bingo industry is worried that its members would be alienated by the harder gambling atmosphere if bingo halls merged with casinos, forcing some to close. Jane Waugh, BBC News.
Americans are threatening to fight through the courts to stop the introduction of a British policing idea on their streets. Police cameras monitored from a special control room may be an everyday part of life in the United Kingdom, but in Washington it's seen as unconstitutional, even after the events of September the 11th.
In the heart of America, agents of the state keep watch on the people. They say they're defending democracy. They're accused of abusing power. The command center brings in live pictures from 20 cameras watching major sites around the city. They're working on bringing in hundreds more, watching roads, railways, schools.
The real purpose of the cameras is to be able to have the opportunity to focus on buildings more than people. Although we do have a good capacity to zoom in from as many as 12 blocks away to a very tight shot of a building or a particular vehicle, for example.
What they have to decide is how far this goes. It's possible to pull in thousands of cameras, including, for instance, those in the foyers of apartment buildings. And the next generation could use software that scans the faces in a crowd looking for wanted criminals and automatically spotting them. Civil liberty groups say even the simplest use of cameras is a breach of privacy, and so against America's Constitution.
When there have been these proposals in the past to dramatically expand state surveillance by means of new technology, there has typically been a public outcry. And even after September 11th, you are still seeing in the U.S. opposition to national identity card, biometrics, face recognition.
Washington's main railway station is one of the buildings where people are being watched, and many don't realize it yet.
Am I being watched now? Big Brother. That's what's wrong with it.
Invading privacy? I don't think it's very good. I think it stinks, really. It's, you know, I think you should have some privacy.
Well, I don't think that you have any expectation of privacy in such a public place. I think it's, you know, you've got a million eyes on you anyway. Why not have some policemen on you?
You can see from the clarity here that you aren't able to recognize people. That's not what we're looking for. We're looking for what would constitute any kind of suspicious activity.
The chief of police is aware that people are suspicious, but he believes they're mistaken and that he can win them over.
There's nothing sinister here going on. I mean, it's not as if we've created this whole thing, failed to tell anybody, won't let anybody in to take a look at it. So I think openness and honesty is the best way to reassure people that there's no intent to misuse it, and there isn't.
The police say pictures won't be routinely recorded, they won't use face recognition software, and they'll only operate the centre during emergencies. With $7 million spent, they believe the argument isn't whether they'll watch Washington from here, but how closely. Paul Welsh, BBC News, Washington.
2 satellites which scientists say will help to create the best map yet of the Earth's gravitational field have been launched from Russia. The project's being jointly operated by space agencies in Germany and the United States.
The Plasetsk Cosmodrome, 650 kilometres northeast of St. Petersburg. The rocket waits on the launch pad. Inside, 2 satellites, part of a project developed by the American space agency NASA and Astrium, the German research company. Once in orbit, the 2 satellites will circle the Earth 200 kilometres apart, but connected by a microwave link. The distance will change continuously as the gravity field varies, and they'll measure those irregularities to an accuracy of thousandths of a millimetre. The Earth's gravity field alters in part because of changes in the magma in the Earth's interior and also by the shifting mass of the oceans. The polar ice caps are melting, due, according to many scientists, to global warming and causing sea levels to rise. To understand exactly what's happening and why, scientists need precise charts of ocean currents, shifts in atmospheric pressure and changes in gravitational force. All of them interact to affect life on Earth. This project is due to last 5 years. The space agencies hope that this type of satellite-based investigation will provide the model for future exploration.
The Six Nations kicks off again on Saturday from 1 o'clock with Ireland v Italy and Scotland v France. Live and interactive on the BBC.
As uncertainty grows in the business world,
our stock market report begins.
Our dedicated staff continue to provide in-depth, up-to-the-minute reporting on international news and business. For regular business updates, join World Business Report and Business Today on BBC News 24.